Okay, welcome back guys. So, today I want to talk about OAuth. So firstly, what is it? Well, it's a way to log in to a client app and basically connect two apps together. Let's first just show an example of the login flow. What I want to show is an application client logging in and using a Reddit account. Reddit is a site with a pretty open API, and there's a bunch of different Reddit apps. You've probably used some of these different ones in the App Store. So these can be web clients or iOS or Android apps. Let's use a web client as an example. I'm logged in on Reddit. This is my account. I'm going to keep the network tab open here so we can have a look at what's happening. Let's go to this client app, which is a web app. So you can see I'm not logged in, and we have to connect the two apps together. I click login, and I'm taken to a Reddit authorize URL. This is the request here. So we've made this authorize request and included some parameters here, which we'll explain more later. We then accept, and we're logged in. What happened is, when we submitted that authorized page, we submitted a form with a post request, and in that form, we included this authorize allow. A couple of other redirects happened here and here, where we go back to our redirect URI, which is auth/callback. It included the state and code params, and then when that request finished, that redirects us, and then we did that final get, where this redirected us to Trot It, just the homepage, and we just finally got that. The only difference now is that we're logged in, and we actually have a profile. So what exactly just happened here? So we need the login button first to be able to kick off the process. So we load the page and we get a login button. So we haven't started the OAuth 2 flow yet. That's just this point in the flow where I've just loaded a blank Reddit page and I'm not logged in yet. When we click the login button, the OAuth 2 flow begins. We are taken to this special endpoint authorize. That's where we grant access to our Reddit account. There's a standard defined set of query params that we have to include here, defining the type of flow, which is code in this case, what permissions we are requesting, the scope, a state param, which is just a randomly generated string that's going to validate the returning request. I'll explain that more in a moment. And the redirect URI, which is where we're going to be redirected after the user has granted access. That's these params in this request from earlier. So we hit this authorized endpoint, and we have to include a standard set of params with that. You can see the different permissions that this app wants to take from my Reddit account. You can see that the request type is a code. We want to get a code from Reddit and use that. And you can see that we've generated a state param, which is just a random string that we'll validate later. The Reddit app now presents us with a simple form. It shows what permissions we are granting, and it allows the user to allow or deny. Once we submit this form, Reddit will redirect us back to our redirect URI that we initially gave it, but now it will attach a special code that it's generated. It also attaches that initial state param that we gave at the start as well. Here we can see that redirected request. When we submitted that form, we got redirected back to that redirect URI. Here it's auth/callback/Reddit, and in that form we included this authorize allow in the form data. And we can see what happened after we did get redirected here is we went to that auth callback URL and we included the state param, which is the same one from earlier, bfx, and we also got this special code which was generated on the Reddit side. So now we've been redirected back to our app. Now a few things happen one after the other to log us in. So from the web browser, we hit this auth callback URL, including the code and state. In the app's backend, this auth callback endpoint, it validates that the state param is the same as it was initially. That's for security. That makes sure no shenanigans happened during the flow already. So we have the same state param passed back to the app now. Then it makes a server-to-server API call. This doesn't go through the browser, but it passes the code to this auth/token endpoint, including the client ID and client secret. This is an extra layer of security because this client has already been registered and been given a client ID and secret. Reddit knows which client is requesting these tokens. So Reddit will go and validate that the code is the one generated earlier. It validates that the client ID and client secret are correct. And then finally we get what we came for. We get what the whole point of this is, which is that we get the access and refresh tokens returned. These are returned server to server. They never go through the web browser. So we won't see these requests happen in the network tab of the browser. Now, once that request to Reddit has finished, once the tokens have been retrieved, we finish that auth callback request, and that is a redirect as well. And then we can fetch that home page. And we can see that here in the network tab. So we did a GET request on the auth callback URL, and we included the state and code params. And we don't see it here in the browser, but right now this client site has in its backend used this code to grab access and refresh tokens from Reddit's API, and it's gone and stored that in its database. Only after all that's finished, fetching the tokens, does it finally finish this request and just send us back to the home page. And that's what you can see in the last request here. We'll never see the access and refresh tokens here in the network tab. We never see our tokens as the user. The tokens are stored in the app's backend. This is a good thing, it's more secure. All we have is a normal cookie session with the client app, which is then fetching our Reddit data with these server-to-server API calls using our access tokens and returning that to us. We don't see these calls being made in the browser. Normal Reddit data like comments and posts would be called resources, and they're fetched from the resource server. This authorize URL and this token URL that give us code or give us tokens, this is known as the auth server in the OAuth 2 flow. Sometimes these are the same server, sometimes they're different. As the client, you don't really have to worry about how they've implemented it on their side. You just need to be able to call these two APIs. I think it really helps to think about the process backwards as well. Let's look at the steps again going backwards. So from a high level, we're the client app here. What do we really want? All we want is the auth server to send us access and refresh tokens for this user. That's really what we want. We want it to be server to server, that's it. To do that, we request them from the auth server, but this request needs to be authenticated and belong to a certain user. So before we can request the tokens, we need a code. To get the code, we need the auth server to generate a code and give it to us. That means we need that auth server to pass that code back to that callback URL first. How do we get the auth server to generate a code? Well, we need to send the user to that special authorize URL that we generate, and then the user will log in there, and then the auth server will know that the user is authenticated and it knows to generate a code. And how do we know where to send that user initially? Well, we first show them that button that is going to send them to the right place, to that authorized URL with all those params that we need, all these code, scope, and state and redirect URI. This process is a very standardized and highly secure flow, and it allows lots of apps to integrate with each other. Now, if you're implementing OAuth, first you need to figure out if you're the client or if you're the auth server. It's probably more common to be the client, like a Reddit client app or some other app where you're logging into someone's account on Facebook or Google or Reddit. Every client first needs to actually register with the main app. This is how you get the client ID and client secret. You usually also register your valid redirect URIs. This is to stop you from redirecting to a malicious site. So in this step, Reddit will check that redirect URI if it matches the ones you registered at the start, and it has to match before it will allow you to continue and generate a code. It won't generate a code if that redirect URI doesn't match your registered one. It won't let you get a code unless that redirect URI is valid. So if you're implementing a client, what do we really need? Well, let's go and put a box around that. Look at the arrows going in and out. That's what we need to implement. The client first needs to send the user off to that authorize URL here. It needs to supply the correct login button to the user. So step one is to have a button that sends the user to the right place with all the right params. It has to generate a state param here and store it somewhere so that it can be verified later as well. This is usually done in the database or some other kind of cache. The client then just needs this callback endpoint, a redirect URI endpoint, where it can validate the state param, accept that code, send that code off to the token endpoint, and swap it for access and refresh tokens. Then it needs to receive those tokens and store them somewhere in its database, mapping it to that user, and then that request can then do whatever it wants. It can redirect to the home page. All of these requests happen in one step as soon as the user gets redirected back to that callback URL. So it's really just two things for the client. It's just send the user off to get the code and then handle the code and swap it for tokens. Get the code, handle the code. So I hope that flow makes sense. And I think the key step is just to understand how that code for token swap happens server to server. And I think it helps to see that example as well. So hopefully you learned something about the OAuth flow there, and I'll see you in the next video.